Alright, hey AP Chemistry, this is the quick video of what to make sure you read and outline and understand in sections 18.6 and 18.8. Now in the very beginning in 18.6 there's all of this derivation of how to calculate for delta G. We don't really need to worry about that in AP Chemistry. It's cool to know, but you don't have to worry about that. Just know the be-all, end-all equation, which is G equals H minus Ts. Basically, Gibbs free energy can be calculated by taking enthalpy and subtracting it by the temperature times entropy. Okay? Then, Then make sure you know this summary. That delta G is proportional to the negative delta S of the universe. So basically, whatever happens to delta S, the opposite's happening to entropy as far as spontaneity. So it says it up here that if I have a positive delta S, which means spontaneous, I'll get a negative delta G. That means negative Gibbs free energy, which means spontaneity, and that's what it says right here. So make sure you know that if delta G is negative, we have spontaneous reactions now. If delta G is positive, non-spontaneous. And then this, I'm not even kidding you, these four cases in this next section of the effect of delta H, delta S, and T on spontaneity is the most important thing that you will read and outline in these sections and in this chapter. The AP exam will ask you all about this, so make sure you critically read all of these cases. What happens to delta H and delta S being positive, and what happens to spontaneity? What happens when delta H is positive and delta S is negative? What happens when delta H is negative and delta S is negative? What happens when delta H is positive and when delta S is positive? I put 3 questions in the Google form to make sure you understand how to read and interpret that. You need to know that, and you could summarize all of that in this amazing table. You need to know this table. I'm not kidding. You need to make sure you either memorize or make sense of this table. There's a way to make sense of it if you could hold on to your algebra skills and do things with like adding and subtracting. Otherwise, you need to memorize this table. And then knowing how to calculate delta G from delta H and delta S is a plug and chug, but your job is to determine whether or not it's spontaneous. So knowing how to do a calculation, and this question from practice 18.4 is in the Google form. And then skipping over to 18.8, because we already did 18.7, and 18.8, we just bring back calculating delta G from standard values. So going to 18.8, you just have to know, I skipped kind of this. You will get a question that's like this, so you will have to know how to do calculating standard free energy changes with delta H, delta S, and delta S and delta H. So what'll happen is, if you look at example 18.6, you may be given a question like this on the AP exam where they only give you the delta H and delta S values of the reactants and products, and it's up to you to figure out the delta G of the reaction. So I would record and make a note of example 18.6 and see if you could try and understand and do the practice problem for this. We will do practice problems like this in class, where all I give you is delta H values and delta S values, and it's up to you to get to delta G and tell me if it's spontaneous. What I did put on your Google form was a question like this, where I give you standard delta G values, and we've done this with delta H, and we've done this with delta S, so we could also do this with delta G. If I give you delta G values, the sum of the delta G of the products minus the sum of the delta G of the reactants is going to be delta G of the reaction. So I put a question like this on your Google form. Make sure you know that it's products minus reactants, and make sure if I give you a table of those values, you need to be able to look in the chemical equation and say, okay, where are my products, where are my reactants, and plug and chug into that equation. And then the last sort of thing, you don't have to worry about this delta G from stepwise. Skip that. That's kind of like calculating delta H stepwise, and that's really outside the scope of this AP world. So don't worry about the stepwise stuff. You could skip that. You could skip this problem. I would like you to know why delta G or why free energy is free. Kind of read and interpret and understand that so you know what it means by free energy. This is kind of the concept of why do we call it Gibbs free energy, and why would negative free energy mean that a reaction is spontaneous. So I would read and kind of get like 4 to 5 summary notes from this last section, and then you are good for reading and outlining section 18.6 and 18.8. Make sure you understand Gibbs free energy and spontaneity.